What's up guys, James here, how you doing? So Koki Pirate did a response to me regarding patriarchy and male disposability, raised some interesting points, some good questions which I think deserve answering quite thoroughly in a video response. I'll be getting to that in just a sec, but I have to give a shout out to Girl Writes What. She recently favourited one of my videos and gained me about 70 subscribers overnight, so thank you very much for that. I'll link to her channel down below, so check her out. Also, there were a few comments which I wanted to respond to as well, one on my previous video and one on Koki's. I'll be dealing with those at the end of this video. So let's see what Koki has to say.
Hey, this is Koki Pirate, and I felt compelled to make a video response to Yes I Am James's video on the topic of patriarchy, in which he posits, he claims that disposable male theory holds up to scrutiny far better than patriarchy theory. And disposable male theory, just to give a sort of brief synopsis as he described it, is that because any given community is its carrying capacity is limited by the amount of females within said community, and I'd say that's a very correct premise for most animals, just due to gestation and stuff. We can do a lot better with fewer men than we can do with fewer women. That there is a selective pressure towards putting men in riskier positions, treating men as more disposable objects in order to secure resources and security for the females.
That's an accurate and honest synopsis of my view, but I would go a lot further than that. Male disposability is almost a universal among the animal kingdom, and male disposability, I suspect, would be directly proportional to the biological cost that females endure from birth or laying eggs. Also, as I said in my previous video, technology has drastically increased survival rates for both babies and mothers to the point where enforced male disposability should have absolutely zero bearing on modern life, but our natural instincts just haven't yet caught up.
And this somehow translates into domestic affairs, causing men to pursue riskier careers in finance and politics, and I mean somehow this translates into religious affairs or something. The idea is that women choosing secure positions in childcare and cleaning and things of this nature, and men assuming positions of great influence. And men, obviously the bulk majority of men are also on the bottom of the spectrum, living in extreme poverty and such, is largely a product of this kind of male disposability that develops in what he says most cultures. Not sure what he means by most cultures, if he means the cultures which most people live in, or every individual cultural segment. I don't even know how you would divide that. Cultures don't really occur in a vacuum.
Before I continue, I'd just like to clear something up for the benefit of those who haven't watched the previous video. The definition I used for patriarchy theory before was the idea that men elevated men for their express benefit, resulting in the oppression of women. In this video, the definition I'll be mainly using is a society where men hold the majority of the power. Okay, so my premise is that women historically have been given inherent value simply on the basis that they can give birth, as population growth is limited by women. Men, on the other hand, did not have inherent value, as there's a near-endless line of men willing to take their place at virtually no biological cost for having a child. So they had to earn their right to reproduce, because they'd be competing. Just like most other animals, this entailed proving themselves as a provider, whether that be providing protection, resources, or entertainment. Of course, sometimes it is the other way round, but generally that's how it goes. As a result, in humans, men tend to strive harder to get into positions of high status and put themselves in greater risk, whereas women are conditioned to play it safe. It's also written into our DNA. The Y chromosome is the most rapidly evolving part of our genome, and the massive differences in average physical strength isn't something you'd expect to see by chance. You just don't see evolution being that wasteful. It suggests that men were the ones who were doing the more dangerous activities and putting themselves in more physical risk. It also seems inconceivable that evolution wouldn't diminish our sense of empathy for those who perform high-risk activities. Also, I don't think it's coincidence that men are the ones with one X chromosome, leading to higher rates of genetic disorders. I suspect that it's an evolved mechanism promoting greater variability in the disposable sex. In essence, even the genetic code itself takes higher risk gambles with us. Women are more neotical in their features. They resemble youth more than men do, rounder faces, smaller bodies, etc., which invokes a more protective response in people. And I suspect the reason so many academic feminists outright reject evopsych and the idea that gender is biological is that it goes a long way in debunking their ideology. Anyway, moving on. Yes, no culture exists in a vacuum, but they still have the ability to adapt to their individual needs and beliefs. So if we see a trait which is near universal, it's very likely that there's an evolutionary explanation behind it. Most anthropologists hold to the idea that there's no known societies which are unambiguously matriarchal. Some are less patriarchal than others, some may be quite egalitarian in consequence, some have women which control certain types of industries, but there are none which are direct parallels of what would be considered patriarchy by the classical definitions that we know of. There's a few books on the subject as well: The Inevitability of Patriarchy, The Myth of Matriarchy, Human Universals, and The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory, and I'm sure there's plenty of others as well. Now, as far as I know, even those societies which you could describe as non-patriarchal, they still would have exhibited male disposability more strongly than female disposability. The only times when the reverse would have been true, as far as I know of, if you have any other information, please let me know. But the only exceptions I could think of would be very, very localized or short-lasting events. Even in places where women were burned as witches, or they were stoned to death, etc., the amount of men dying in wars or being murdered, dying in industrial accidents, etc., would have drastically exceeded those numbers.
But I don't think that he gives this the same degree of scrutiny that he does what he calls patriarchy theory. I mean, if this were true, if it were based on community's carrying capacity and the extreme limits of pre-industrial society, then you would assume that hunter-gatherer communities or Stone Age agrarian communities would have higher tendency towards patriarchy, or I guess he wouldn't use the word patriarchy, but this kind of setup with men in power, than come when you compare it to industrial societies.
As I said before, the idea of matriarchal prehistory isn't generally accepted, but it could be a valid hypothesis. In a small village where men are out hunting all day, which is far more physically demanding than picking fruit and berries, the last thing they'd want to do is get home and tell everybody what to do. But as a society grows and positions of power become something more meaningful to a provider, uh, when it requires travelling, commanding an army, risking being assassinated, etc., this is something that pregnant women wouldn't be suited for, and men would tend to fill those roles. Now, more industrialized nations do have more women in control. If you were to draw a graph of the amount of women, the amount of children women have, and the number of women in office, you would see that there is quite a strong correlation there.
And that just really doesn't seem to be the case. If you could look at various Pacific Islander cultures, a lot of these cultures are fairly egalitarian. We even see some matrilineal cultures where inheritance goes from, goes by the mother's line as opposed to the father's line. We could look at the Siberian steppes, Southeast Asia.
I'm not 100% sure which cultures you're on about with the Siberian steppes and the Southeast Asia communities, so provide links to those and I'll check them out. As for matrilineal societies, that's not mutually exclusive from a society being patriarchal. For example, Orthodox Jews are matrilineal in the sense that Jewishness is inherited from the mother, yet at the same time they're patriarchal in the sense that only men can become rabbis. There's reasons for matrilineal societies and patrilineal societies which could both work within a patriarchal framework.
The natives of South America. These are relatively isolated communities. No culture occurs in a vacuum, and obviously these cultures weren't completely isolated from one another. But I'd say that they're far more isolated from one another than the industrial communities that emerged in Europe. The sophisticated Iron Age societies that emerged in Africa and proto-industrial communities that emerged in India and China. They had a great deal more interaction, um, and even among the North American natives, the Iroquois League had something of a matriarchal setup, and there were various recorded instances of women who had been abducted by the Native Americans actually preferring Native American life due to the just all around better status of women, the greater economic self determination, and things of that nature.
The Iroquois are quite an interesting case study. They are considered the closest thing to a matriarchy, though they certainly aren't a direct parallel to a patriarchy. Only men could become chieftains, but only women could elect them. The chieftains officially had the power and responsibility, but they could be removed at any time if they didn't look after the women's interests. So the women were effectively the ones in power. Women had all the power, but indirectly. I would say that this is the case with many patriarchal societies, but not to anywhere near that extreme. It's also worth noting that they still exhibited male disposability in the sense that the males were still the hunters and the warriors.
In other societies, like this mass slaughter of men, you really, don't see this as much. This priority to send waves of men into battle and such. And I don't see the connection between like putting men out to battle and men assuming positions of political importance.
It mainly comes down to men being the workers and the providers. People generally work up hierarchies unless they are born into power. Now, most of the jobs in the past were very dangerous and physically demanding compared with today. Hunting, farming, blacksmithing, building, security, etc. And the people in these jobs would have been more accepting of authority which had worked their way up and understood their work from first-hand personal experience. Of course, society has worked towards making these jobs safer and less physically demanding, and has created plenty of industries where strength isn't a requirement at all. So, again, this makes patriarchy today completely obsolete.
So I'm just wondering, how on earth is this disposable male theory verifiable? At least that, because the first thing that I could think of that could possibly verify it just seems completely false. It seems like confirmation bias. We live in a culture that, things are just sort of fell the way they are, and we see it in other cultures, but these cultures didn't emerge in a vacuum. They sort of fed into each other. And I suppose we should clarify my lexicon compared to Yes, I Am James. Yes, I Am James seems to consider patriarchy theory and disposable male theory as sort of two competing theories to explain the state of affairs that we have, society's ailment. Now, I consider patriarchy the what? That is to say that men control most of the political seats, they control the bulk majority.
As I said, I was debunking patriarchy as defined by the academic feminists, and I'm happy using patriarchy to simply describe the what, as you put it, that being men being in positions of power more often than women. Now, if it was just today's integrated world where patriarchy and male disposability coincided, then you may have a point, but it appears to be a universal across recorded cultures. So what I'm saying is that high-risk behaviour, such as male disposability, can lead to big losses and occasionally big gains. If we see a cultural universal, the chances are that there is a biological explanation. And male disposability has been a universal and has a high chance of creating patriarchy through an explained plausible mechanism, whereas a matriarchal equivalent couldn't work. Of course, we also see the same thing in nature, frequently with alpha males. A male with access to the whole female population would have far more reproductive success than the inverse. As for matriarchal species, they still have male disposability. Colonial insects such as ants and wasps take this to the extreme. The males are the providers and the protectors, and the colony will risk losing all of them in order to protect the queen. Now, bonobos are considered matriarchal by most people, though they are actually quite egalitarian, with an aspect of female protection and matrilineage. Of course, they don't know who their fathers are, so they kind of have to be matrilineal. Both males and females can become leaders, but the females have a very strong in-group preference, which we also kind of see with humans, and so they fight less frequency than the males, which is a minor level of male disposability. Now, in the last 20,000 years, population genetics has managed to select for lactose tolerance, disease resistance, skin tones, etc. Natural selection can also rapidly work on sexual selection and body and muscle mass, yet somehow males in every single population discovered have been considerably more muscular than females since before we diverged from orangutans over 15 million years ago. And the large muscle mass is a trait you would expect from a creature who's been selected for based on their ability to survive dangerous environments. And of course, male disposability still exists today in every single culture. Now, the common feminist explanation, however, is absolutely full of holes. They posit that women aren't in power today due to discrimination, but this hypothesis has no credible evidence to back it up whatsoever. Now, women actually vote more than men today, and there are more women of voting age than men due to longer lives. And when women are nominated, they get elected with a very similar frequency than men. The pay gap is nearly exclusively due to choices men and women make based on known factors, and this appears to be true of women in politics as well, according to a source I've left down below. It's the choices which men and women make which change the outcome. Now, the thing is, women still expect men to be providers, and there's far more stigma being put towards house husbands than there is housewives. So, of course, men have more pressure on them to perform. They also want to get rid of the pay gap. So, of course, women can't have it both ways. One way or the other, they're going to be disappointed there. But as I said, the evidence doesn't show that there's any form of top-down discrimination against women wanting to get into positions of power. It appears to be the differences in choices that they're making, and women expecting men to be the providers. So if we want to get rid of what we've been calling the patriarchy, then it's the attitudes towards men which will need to be changed.
Positions of economic influence, and they're actively blocking women from assuming positions of religious significance.
Religious influence on gender roles is an interesting topic. Yes, some religions don't let women into positions of power within their ranks, and the problem is dogmatic thinking. They see men are generally the ones in power, so the people making the religions assume that that must be the way God wanted it to be, and anything else is an abomination. They certainly reinforced patriarchy, but I suspect that when these rules started, it was a reaction to the culture, not the culture reacting to the religion. And they certainly haven't had any legal effect on women's right to work for a very long time now. Now, religion has certainly had a deleterious effect on women in the past, but it has also affected men. If you are to speak to a religious person with strong views on women's roles, inevitably they will also have equally strong views on men's roles, that men have to be the provider and the protector, etc. I think that there's also forms of Wiccan beliefs which are quite female supremacist as well, and to the people who are offended by these religions, I simply say, it's bullshit, so find another religion instead.
And that's what I consider patriarchy. I see disposable male theory as a proposed why, just like many other different suggested patriarchy theories. But what he's saying is that we need to get this diagnosis correct in order to treat it correctly. Because obviously if you give someone a bad diagnosis, then the treatment that you will offer informed by this we could possibly exacerbate the problem or result in new problems. And the conclusion that he draws from male disposability theory is that we need to put a great deal more emphasis on individuality. And I don't really see how that's the logical conclusion of disposable male theory. And I certainly don't see any reason to think as to why that would necessarily improve the conditions that we live in, that women will no longer have the selective pressure to pursue what he claims are more secure jobs, and men to stop pursuing to remove the pressure for men to select what he claims are riskier jobs.
Firstly, I'm going to examine the idea of quotas before moving into individualism. I've dealt with this before in videos in more depth, but basically implementing quotas works from the presumption that discrimination is working from the top down because men just simply can't help themselves from being sexist pigs. And the only way we can prevent them from being sexist pigs is to implement policies or laws forcing equal outcome. It's equal opportunity which matters, not forcing an equal outcome. Now, this is legal sexism, and of course it hurts the voters as well by automatically removing the majority of the potential best candidates. As I've said before, the evidence doesn't point to a top-down discrimination against women, so this is certainly the wrong solution. It doesn't matter whether 10% or 90% of politicians are female, and the same goes for any other profession. As long as people are there of their own free will and they've been given equal treatment, that's all that really matters. As long as society isn't pressuring a particular sex to act in a certain way, viewing them as scum for not acting in that way or conforming, and not forcing them to do things by law, really, that's all that matters. That is getting rid of sexism. It's not sexist that men are 6 inches taller than women. That's just the way it is. Same with many behavioural things. That's basically my attitude towards it. Give people fair treatment. Don't try and force an unnatural equal outcome.
And so, yeah, I mean, the way he presents himself, you'd think that there'd be something in the way of evidence for either side, but I understand we're all lay people, but as far as I recall, there's not even a citation. If there wasn't a description and I just forgot about it or something, I'll correct myself. But yeah, I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts.
I'll leave some links down below, but I brought up reasoning from genetics, psychology, anthropology, politics, and history. And I think that by this point, we're at the stage where data needs to be presented to falsify what I'm saying rather than the other way around. So yeah, I'll leave loads of links down below. If I find any more, then I'll put them down below as well. Perhaps there'll even be a follow-up to this video, who knows. But for now, I'm going to be dealing with some of the comments which I've seen. So I was going to respond to a comment by a user who goes by the name Jane Anger, but I decided against it. It was so dumb that her message just kind of spoke for itself. But I would like to reply to 2 comments, one by Cokie Pirate and one by Sickmouth. There's a few words in Cokie Pirate's comment which I struggle to pronounce, because I do struggle with pronouncing quite a lot of foreign words. But let's try anyway. I don't think that's entirely fair. There's plenty of cultures where they are both put at risk equally, so why does it have to be the opposite? That being said, I know of at least 2 tribes in Africa with female warrior castes, the Dahomey Mino and the Isachi Koseshi. For the Japanese upper class, there was the Ona Buge Isha. I probably completely butchered that. But, I decided to check them out. So, as for the Dahomey Mino, they were only 1/3 of the Dahomey army, so in that case, men were still more disposable than women. For the Isachi Koseshi, all I could find for those was Nupe women warriors called Isachi Koseshi fought as fiercely as the men, opposing invasions of the Fulbe conquerors who raided the Nupe for cattle and slaves, especially women. So here's a few things there. So they raided the slaves they were after were women, because the women inherently have more value than men. That works with my hypothesis. It says they fought as fiercely as the men, implying that there were men present. I can't say whether or not there were more men than women, but I would guess that that's probably the case. Regardless, that's not really that doesn't show that female disposability was implemented more than male disposability in that culture. As for the female Japanese warriors, they were still a tiny fraction of the overall warrior caste in Japan. So, regardless, male disposability is still more prominent in that culture than female disposability. I'd be very surprised if a legitimate example where where in a large culture women were warriors more often than men. The only explanation I could think of for such an event would be that the warriors on the other side would be less inclined to try to kill them, but the cost would outweigh the benefit to the society implementing the female warriors. As for Thickmouth's comment, to add to this, I feel like if any group of people in society, or at least American society, is considered disposable, it's not men so much as it is working class and poor people. They're the ones who work for wealthy corporations, who bribe those in government, and they're the ones who are often forced to join the army and risk their lives for those rich arseholes because the army provides them with everything they need. Disposability is based on class, not gender. Now, Thickmouth is generally considered to be one of the more moderate feminists, but that comment really did seem to be just taken directly from the academic feminist handbook, the feminists who will stop at nothing to deny any legitimate examples where men have it worse. Now, when it comes to homelessness, incarceration, genital mutilation, workplace fatalities, suicide, cancer, and cancer funding, all of those issues are far more gendered than the issue of women in power. Massively more so. And they affect tremendously more people. But when when we have these gendered issues come up, oh no, that's nothing to do with gender. That's class, or that's economics. It's just completely blown to one side because it doesn't fit within the narrative of women being oppressed. And by this logic, I could also say, the sex workers being murdered, that's not a feminist issue. That's a class thing. That's nothing to do with feminism. Men also account for the vast majority of victims for all forms of violence except for rape and domestic assault, which are actually a lot more even than people tend to think. Now, is there any doubt in anybody's mind that if women were the majority of the homeless, the incarcerated, the genitally mutilated, workplace fatalities, etc., is there any doubt that feminists would say, oh, well, that's nothing to do with us, that's a class thing, that's to do with economics? No, absolutely not. They would be absolutely banding together against those things. But as these are problems which men tend to face, the government is doing very, very little about it. So I think I've presented my case pretty well here. Again, lots of links down in the description box. Thanks for watching. Comment, rate, subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.